Picture this. You wake up, you check your phone, and your favorite artist is going on tour. You immediately go to your computer to check the dates and get a ticket for a show near you. Then you remember you don't live in a major city and you resign yourself to never seeing the artist play. Does this sound familiar? If so, you might be living in an underrepresented media market. Well, what does this mean? It means good luck trying to find an artist who's coming to your area. Looking at a lot of major artist tour dates, we can see that a lot of major artists rarely, if ever, come to any cities or areas that are not major cities across the globe or in the United States. Looking at a lot of major artists' tours right now, most of them don't come that close to where I am. For Sabrina Carpenter, she only gets as close to Maryland as Pittsburgh, PA. Coldplay only gets as close as Boston, and the Kendrick Lamar SCA tour gets as close as Washington, D.C., same with Beyoncé's current tour. I did, however, find out that Katy Perry is playing at the CFG Arena in Baltimore, so that's kinda cool. Now, why is this? Why do artists only ever go to the biggest cities in America and the globe, while the rest of us are left driving potentially hours to see a large artist perform? And what if you don't have a car? What if you rely on public transportation? My name is Flesh, and today we'll be going over why your favorite artists don't come to your area. Now, as a disclaimer, I'm going to be using Baltimore as an example area for a smaller market that doesn't have a lot of support from major artists. We rarely, if ever, see major artists, and if they do show up, it's usually only one stop on a tour every few years. It's the closest major city that I live to, and I try to make my videos relevant to that, but what I'm going to go over applies to like 95% of you, maybe even more so if you're in an even smaller area. You should be able to follow along, but obviously some of the more in-depth stuff won't apply to you. With that out of the way, let's get into why your favorite artists aren't performing near you. Now, probably the obvious reason for most bands showing up is scheduling. Venues only have a certain amount of space for shows they can have at any given time, so sometimes there just isn't room for one show or another. Especially when you consider the logistics of getting a massive show into space, it can take days, potentially weeks to get everything set up and taken down. This would include things like pyrotechnics, staff, the artists themselves. Artists also tend to perform at venues they've already been to, particularly if they got good sales or a really good show and a really good turnout. Now, although scheduling can be a large reason for a band not showing up to areas, it's not the only reason, and you'd think that despite the fact that a season may be booked, artists can always catch the next season, right? Well, yes, and many times they do, but it's not going to be nearly as common as them putting on shows in places like LA, New York, or Chicago that have multiple huge venues for multiple artists to perform, sometimes even on the same night. Which brings us to our next topic, venue size. Venue size is a really large factor if an artist is going to show up to your area or not. If you don't have huge venues, it goes to reason that they're probably not coming near you. The music industry is one of the biggest examples of a for-profit, pretty greedy business, so they're going to do everything they can to make the most amount of money for the least investment possible. This means they're going to pack you in to the largest venue they possibly can for the artist. I'm going to be talking about different venues, starting off with smaller bar-type venues and going to the largest in the area, because each venue caters to different artists of different sizes, and even different genres in a lot of different cases. Now, when it comes to Baltimore, we have a lot of iconic and memorable small venues that have hosted big acts like the Auto Bar and Metro Gallery, but these places are more so a large bar with an attached venue space and have capacities of a few hundred people maximum. So you mainly see local bands and smaller touring acts playing at places like this that won't be drawing in thousands of people. Occasionally though, they host some bigger acts. A lot of big punk and metal acts will come to places like this, mainly because they might not draw as big of a crowd as someone as Beyoncé, but they still will draw in a sizable crowd that would love to see them in a place like this. Next up, we have some medium-sized venues, which I classify as being around 1,000 to 1,500 people and operating primarily as a venue rather than a bar with an attached space. In Baltimore, we have places like Baltimore Soundstage and Ram's Head. These can be a lot larger and will host a lot of bigger acts, although you won't really see any A-list celebrities. Beyoncé and Billie Eilish will not play at venues like this if this is the largest place in your area. I'm sorry. We then have some larger venues that fall in between medium-sized venues and huger stadium areas that larger cities will have. A big example in Baltimore would be the Pier 6 Pavilion. These venues are purpose-driven to get bigger acts to an area, usually having capacities of around several thousand attendees, give or take. This is where you'll start to see a lot of big tours and acts coming through, especially a lot of classic rock groups and the like. Finally, we have arena venues, designed to hold a ton of people seated around a central area. These places will have capacities from a few thousand to tens of thousands of people, with the most well-known being Madison Square Garden in New York City. In Baltimore, we have one called the CFG Bank Arena, formerly the Royal Farms Arena, that can hold around 14,000 people. It's around 5,000 shy of Madison Square Garden. Huge artists and their companies doing national and international tours tend to prefer areas like this, since you can cram way more people into the place for not that much money. It's also worth noting that sports stadiums can have concerts being able to seat around 50,000 people or more, although these are not as common because these places can usually only have 1 or 2 shows a year, since they're also reserved for a lot of sports teams and they usually have more difficult contracts that only really big artists can get to. Now, what does all this mean? It means depending on your area and the venues around, you should only expect to see artists who can fit their crowds into the venues. Beyoncé isn't going to play at a small to medium-sized venue, but at the same time, your favorite Norwegian metal band doing their first US tour in years probably isn't going to be playing in an arena unless they're really big. Now, this seems to back up the reasoning that artists stick to areas that have venues that accommodate them, and only larger areas can afford to have these larger venues. But how come they still won't come to certain cities even if they have spaces relatively equivalent to places like Madison Square Garden that could fit their fanbase? Well, that leads to our next talking point, DMAs. A lot of artists and companies tend to base their tours based on where are the most popular DMAs in an area. Now, you may be asking, Flesh, what the heck is a DMA? Well, I'll tell you using a definition from one of the most trusted sources out there, Wikipedia, the free encyclopedia. A media market, broadcast market, media region, designated market area, television market area, or simply market is a region where the population can receive the same television and radio station offerings, and may also include other types of media such as newspapers and internet content. They can coincide with or overlap with one or more metropolitan areas, though rural regions with few significant population centers can also be designated as markets. Markets are identified by the largest city, which is usually located in the center of the region. However, geography and the fact that some metropolitan areas have large cities separated by some distance can make markets have unusual shapes and result in 2, 3, or more names being used to identify a single region, such as Wichita, Hutchinson, Kansas, Chico, Redding, California. You get the picture. Basically, it's a designated area marking the size and strength of an area's audience. Now, in the US, this is administered by the Nielsen Corporation, but in other parts of the world, it's often determined by the government or the government's public media. Big artists and media in general tend to favor the largest market areas since they have the most amount of potential customers, thus giving them more potential revenue from concert sales. You can actually look up the rankings of DMAs from Nielsen, the most recent as of this recording being the 2024 to 2025 season. The largest media market is New York, with Los Angeles being in a close second. These guys are basically the top of the top, they see the most artists, and there's really no chance of them being overtaken anytime soon. Third, we have Chicago, followed by the Dallas-Fort Worth area in Texas, and Philadelphia, PA. Interestingly, Washington, D.C. is at 8th, listed as Washington Hagerstown. The top 10 DMAs tend to be where all the big artists go, and you'll see them mainly flocking to these areas and not much else. As of Baltimore, it's standing at a strong but much less impressive 29th place, still drawing in some big artists, but not nearly as much as the top 10 or 5. A lot of other places can rank even lower and might never see a large artist come anywhere near them. If you're in Ottumwa, Kirksville, I have some really bad news. Another thing artists can use in the modern day are metrics that can determine where your biggest listener base is, so that you can go to the biggest places to draw the biggest crowds. If you're an artist and you've uploaded to places like Spotify, you can see this pretty easily. Obviously, a lot of larger artists are going to have people doing this for them since they're backed by giant companies. Now, it goes without saying that there's probably not a huge listener base for most artists in places like rural Idaho, but now companies can see if there's a big audience in any part of the country. Also, for that last part, if you're from rural Idaho, I love you. Like I said before, this is all pretty much fueled exclusively by money, so artists and the music industry will only play in areas where they're guaranteed to get a big turnout, both to reciprocate the loss of a large show and the logistics behind it, and to line their pockets. Now, this all makes sense, right? Artists only play at shows that are guaranteed to have a large audience, so they generally play at bigger areas that not only have multiple adequate venues, but also large fan bases. But how come they won't even stop at some locations beyond once in a blue moon that can meet all of these requirements? That brings us to the radius clause. Another thing that comes into play is the radius clause, which is a thing found in a lot of touring contracts and even a lot of venue contracts, which basically states that after playing a show, you cannot play in a certain radius of the original show for a certain amount of time, either before and after. Now, the overall concept's primary idea is to boost ticket sales for an event by not having an artist playing at competing shows or venues, but the problem lies in the radius clause often preventing artists from playing in smaller venues and even entire areas in cities nearby. As an example, let's say that your band wants to book a show in the DMV. Well, if you book a show in Washington, D.C., the largest media market, there's a good chance that the venue may put in a radius clause. For the purpose of this demonstration, let's say it bars you from playing shows in a 60-mile radius for 60 days before and after the show. If you're doing a national tour, you aren't going to be able to play in an area 60 days before or after just to play in Baltimore or Richmond, so you won't be stopping at those locations while on tour. Unfortunately, this is a very common practice that prevents a lot of bands from playing at a lot of different venues and areas, preventing them from being in certain cities altogether. A way artists can get around this is to book shows that split the difference, which is why a lot of select places in the middle of different areas can get shows. If you're in Maryland, Washington, D.C., Richmond, the Baltimore area in Maryland, you may be familiar with driving to Silver Spring to places like the Fillmore to see your favorite artists. This is often done to draw in fans from a variety of different markets, so you don't need as many stops on a show, and to get around the radius clause. Everything I've said, from DMAs to the radius clause, seems to establish why artists don't play at a lot of cities. But there's one aspect of why bands don't play in areas that I wanted to finish off with. Now, before continuing, I just want to say that there isn't a lot of formal research or evidence of this. However, it's still too big of a thing to ignore, and many people believe online and in person that I've spoken with that this is a large reason why some areas are ignored. The unfortunate reality is that the music industry is very image-based, being almost entirely founded on the glitz and glamour of making it big and having large crowds in huge cities. Many locations in the US just don't have the same appeal to people like New York or LA, especially to people who aren't from those areas. They don't have the draw of being the home of show business, and a lot of cities can be ignored outright just because of a negative image or press. Why does Baltimore get less shows than DC, even ignoring the fact that DC is a larger market? Baltimore often gets more negative press than DC, and just doesn't have the same image. People and artists who aren't from Baltimore tend to view it as crime-ridden or dangerous, and won't want to play a show there even if there's an adequate venue and evidence that there's a large listener base. Plenty of artists will post experiences of playing in areas where they got robbed or were mugged or something like that, and will just refuse to play those areas outright, which can influence a lot of other artists. Now, by no means does this stop all artists from going to a certain area, and a lot of huge artists will play in Baltimore and other smaller markets at least once, but the fact of the matter is that overall, they get played a lot less than the traditional favorites and bigger cities. This can also be justified to them by the cost, with a lot of artists playing in locations that are bigger, but also close to as many markets as possible, hence why you might play at DC instead of Baltimore, so that you can get fans from Maryland and Virginia together. However, this can often exclude people who can't get to those venues, like those who don't have any way of driving to another city, or if there's no way to get public transportation to those areas. It's unfortunate, but as I stated before, the music industry is a profit-driven machine that wants to make the biggest returns possible, and a lot of places and people just get left in the dust in pursuit of that. They don't care about every single fan, they really don't care about you, and they just want to push sales. Does this mean you're without hope if you live in a smaller media market? Well, no, of course not. Many places have local bands and acts that play in multiple venues around cities, in a variety of genres. Now, my last video was on Baltimore's hardcore punk scene, but there's a ton of other scenes and genres that get plenty of time here as well, including huge artists on national tours. A lot of big artists are coming to Baltimore City this year, although it's not nearly as much as places like New York or LA. Also, as time goes on, places change. They build bigger venues to host more acts. Artists can and do play in areas that are not the largest cities, especially when they're on tour. It may not be as often, but more than likely, your favorite artist will play in an area near you, or at least close by. And if they don't, there's always a lot of artists who are probably in your area that are probably looking for people to show up. Go to local shows, go to local venues, experiment a little bit. I think that if you only want to see the largest of the largest artists, then you're probably not going to be doing too good for yourself, especially when there's a lot of really interesting musicians out there who are not supported by these large labels. Go to local shows, maybe even start your own band. Do what you can and get involved in your area and the music around it so that you can better the area and your community as a whole. This is Flesh signing off. Thank you for watching, and thank you for your continued support if you've been watching the channel. It really helps out, and it really inspires me. Thank you so much, and bye.